Great. Well, it's really good to have all of you here. So I'm excited to kind of share some of these ideas around speculative design and the future of cities. How many of you are familiar with speculative design or have heard of the topic? Have maybe done speculative design in your own practice or work? Brilliant. Okay, great. So it'll be an introduction for some and others sort of share some new ideas in the space. So a little by way of background, my name's J. Paul Neeley, and I actually started my career, I graduated in economics and communication studies at Northwestern in Chicago. And I started work at Unilever on a behavioral insights team. So looking at consumer behaviors and understanding details of those behaviors and then feeding those into the brands on product development and marketing. And I kind of very quickly became disillusioned with just selling people more shampoo and deodorant and all these things. And I moved into healthcare, so using the same set of research techniques that we were applying to consumer packaged goods and began working in healthcare settings, working on patient experience and care delivery models. And ended up at a place called the Mayo Clinic. Has anyone heard of the Mayo Clinic? Yeah, so a big academic medical institution in the United States. And we had an embedded design team that took on projects throughout the hospital. And I worked there for a little while and then came and studied at the Royal College of Art on the Design Interactions course. So if anyone's familiar with Tony Dunn and Fiona Raby and their work, I was one of the studying on that course, and then for the last 7 years have been running my own design consultancy where we've been using speculative design techniques to help different groups. So we work with the Cabinet Office Policy Lab on looking at the prevention of homelessness. I've worked with some Mercedes-Benz companies on future of mobility, and also doing a lot of healthcare work as well on kind of wellness and what's next. So currently running that consultancy, and then I also teach at the Royal College of Art on the service design course. So Anya, we should talk. I'm sure we can find an eager student coming out. But we've just now created a platform called Envision, where we're looking to use more speculative techniques in the design of future services. So today, I think the kind of question that I want to talk about is how do we understand the future, and then how do we begin to generate strategy or ways of thinking about it that we can begin to create it. And I think a lot of people are perhaps familiar with future forecasting techniques, and I think that's something that's now well established in different organizations. They have strategy groups, there are consultancies and others that are providing these services to institutions. So I'll quickly share some thoughts there, but then want to show how speculative design as sort of an emerging discipline is enhancing or supplementing those future forecasting techniques. And then briefly talk about how some of these techniques apply to thinking about the future of cities. So the hope is that you each leave with an understanding of speculative design, and you maybe see moments in your own practice that make sense, or in your own organizations that make sense to use these approaches. So just kind of a refresher in terms of the design process, I tend to think of the double diamond sort of extended. So we have a research phase, a design phase, and some sort of implementation. And in terms of speculative design, we have some sort of brief, something that we're starting with. We come to a generation of scenarios or insights, future moments that we're thinking about. And then really a lot of the work ends at this sort of concepts and strategy piece. So then how do we take what we've learned and feed it back into the business? We also tend to think about horizons, and I think generally a lot of times when we're working with companies and organizations, they're quite good at working at the horizon sort of one of 5 to 10 years, but that's actually the extent of their forward thinking. And I think additionally the sort of demands of near-term business goals often cloud the need to think any further out than the next few quarters. And I think there's a huge opportunity to spend more time thinking at these other horizons further out into the future. And we'll talk about why I think there's some value in doing that. So generally, just kind of an overview of the sort of future forecasting approach that we'll use. We often start with signals and a focus. So some sort of signal, something that's happening in the world today that indicates something of interest. So whether that's deep mind and just dominating sort of with AlphaGo in the World Go against the World Go human players, or whether that's inequity in the United States and sort of lowering standards of living in that country. But taking some sort of signal and then laying that against a particular focus, and we'll talk more about that. From that exploration of signals and focus, then generation of scenarios, and I think there's a lot of understanding of that process. But then I think what's very interesting is from those scenarios to develop speculative propositions, look at the implications of those propositions as a way to generate strategy. So I'll talk through kind of each of these quickly. So in terms of signal and interest, again, we love to use future wheels. And I think a lot of times the direct kind of implications of a signal aren't really understood. But what we'll often do with the future wheel is, again, gather the direct consequences of that particular signal, but then we're also interested in the indirect consequences, so the secondary consequences of that. So for example, we were working with some hospitality groups, and we asked them if they had a strategy for artificial intelligence. And no one in the room had thought anything about artificial intelligence. There was no documentation within the organization. There was no perspective on what artificial intelligence meant to their industry. So it's a signal that is happening. We're seeing this, but there isn't perspective. Perspective hasn't been generated within these organizations yet. So we might take that signal and say, well, what does artificial intelligence mean within the hospitality industry? And then we begin to generate, well, what are those direct consequences of things we're seeing there? And then we go further again to look at these indirect consequences as a way to sort of inspire and expand our understanding of what's going on in the space. From that, we generate scenarios, multiple scenarios, to get a perspective on some of the directions that this might go. I'll share some examples of this, but I think one of the big ideas is we always tend to work in multiples. So we're not trying to be predictive or saying this is the future, but we're trying to get a sense of the span of possible directions and possible areas to be explored in the future. We generate then a service proposition. We actually build future products and services. So this would look like any other design process, but we're building a product or a service that might exist 20 years in the future. And so it's quite straightforward. Try to visualize that product in some way, understand the story, the user story, and the experiences someone might go through. But I think then the most important element is what's next. So a lot of times visions of the future sort of end there at that future product and service. If you see a future story from, say, Corning Glass, right? The future is all glass. Everything is glass, and everything is a touch screen. And we are all kind of perfect, beautiful consumers of glass in this world. But in reality, I think it's more interesting to unpack those futures in a different way. So we like to build a sort of future proposition and then explore it in terms of the social, cultural, a sort of extended steep model, technological, ethical, economic, environmental, and political. What are the implications if this product and service exists in the future? We also are really interested in the human experience. So we're not interested in just the technology. In some sense, it doesn't matter what the technology is. We're interested in the consequences of the technology and the indirect consequences of what emerges from that technology. And the focus, again, being the people. So what impact does that have on our lives and how we go about them? And then I think most interesting, and a question that's not asked enough, is how does it go wrong? So particularly, a lot of the work in futures is done to sell a particular future, right? We need investment in this new technology that we're developing. We need organizations to sort of believe in the direction that we're going. But critical for development of strategy and critical to be able to understand these technologies is to understand how it goes wrong, how it messes up, how it causes problems. And so we spend a lot of time looking at sort of the ugliness of whatever's been designed. And I tend to think that a lot of people say technology is not good or bad. But I think of it as actually both. It is good and it is bad, and it's simultaneously good and bad. And often we can't tell the difference. And so it takes a real unpacking of how these things go wrong to get to get a sense of what the impact might be. And then we use that discussion around the implications to generate strategy. So a lot of times these learnings and these explorations of future scenarios let us think about our current directions, what we're interested in, what we value in different ways. So a sort of quick overview of the arc of how we do this. Again, we're looking for signals that exist currently. We're then generating possible future scenarios, and then building speculative propositions, products and services that actually exist in those scenarios. We then interrogate those and question them to develop our current strategy and directions. So I'll give you a few examples. Now, I'm going to spend more time on sort of the speculative design piece, but just a quick example for those not familiar with future forecasting. So often we do signal exploration, and we'll brief for a client, say, 120 different signals or things that we're seeing. So cutting edge technology that's just coming out of the lab, social trends or pressures. So just a handful of examples here. So pollution and the air quality in Beijing is quite an interesting situation there, that you have an entire population living in such a sort of dire air quality situation. But also London, right? I think London has quite pathetic air quality. I think we blew through EU regulated air quality for small particulates in the first 5 days of the year. So I mean, we're living in a really ugly city in terms of air quality, but that relation to air and to pollution is interesting. The second is GBO, so home electronics and robotics and assistants like Alexa and others are coming very quickly. And what do those mean for privacy and relationships and data within the home? Populism and Trump. As an American, I apologize for everything that's happening now, but those forces and everything that's going on with that election and some of the messaging there are absolutely a signal to be considered and understood. So I mentioned AlphaGo beating the world's top Go players, and I think they just held a competition this week as well and beat the world champion in Go. Is everyone familiar with this? I'm guessing in this audience, yes. But again, Go has more or as many moves as there are atoms in the universe. It's impossible for the computers to sort of calculate all of the moves to the end, and it leaves them to sort of create an intuition about the best moves. Well, they recently played, it handily beat one of the world's best Go players last year, and in this last week played the #1 Go player, a 19-year-old, and destroyed, I think actually they're in the match now, but beat him in the first match, and he described it as non-human, and actually it's over for the humans. He said it went from playing like a human last time to playing like a god, and so sort of god of Go. But the advances in the artificial intelligence space, I think, are overwhelming, and I don't think we even sort of grasp what they mean yet. And often, many companies that will be hugely impacted by them, organizations that will be hugely impacted by these new technologies, are unaware of what that means. Drones, I think, are fascinating. I'll race through these just quickly, but Tesla's supercharging network in the United States, VR and AR and Oculus and some of those technologies becoming available. Self-driving cars, I forget the exact date on the Tesla announcement, but I think it's fully autonomous at the end of the year or early next year, but all of the hardware and the software is technically there. I think global other things in addition to technology, we're interested in these social signals. So I think growing inequity and the work of Thomas Piketty and Capital in the 21st Century and those types of questions about inequity and about is inequity actually built into our capitalist system is quite scary. And things like obesity. There are discussions in the United States now that this will be the first generation that has a lower life expectancy than the generation before. I think 66% of Americans are obese or overweight. And so there are huge implications for how we go about looking into the future. So this is just a handful, but we'll look at hundreds of different signals and sort of different things that are emerging. And just an example of a few. So from things like self-quantification, exoskeletons, space, and synthetic biology, to epidemics and privatization, So all over the place. But we're interested in sort of all these different directions where things are emerging. And then from these, again, generate some scenarios. So these are just sketches and not a full scenario that we build. But imagine, again, a sort of particular world exploring data and our relationships to data, where actually we realize the sort of quantified self and utopic visions of Silicon Valley. And all of this data that we're generating actually comes back to us in ways that improve our lives and make them meaningful. Another vision where the government becomes the major hand in our personal data, and governments use that data to leverage and manage population health, looking at tax incentive and nudges and other things. Or a Trump land where actually organizations, I think in some sense this is just an extension of our current state, but organizations like Facebook and other companies continue to use that data to maximize profit and to use their understanding of our behavior and of our weaknesses to sell us more stuff. And then finally, a sort of gone green or moved towards local communities. And would that data be owned in ways that actually could improve our cities in ways meaningful to collective groups of individuals? So those are 4 just different spaces of where our relationship with data might go. So if data was the signal and some of the things are happening in data, and our focus is relationships with that data or ownership, then these become directions. So then speculative design emerges, and I think a lot of times future forecast will be just a document of written text. And the way we relate to that is we sometimes miss a trick. So with speculative design, it's also sometimes called critical design or design futures, design fiction. I think of them as all kind of interchangeable and just related to the intent of the designer or the group using them. If I'm more interested in being critical about the current state, if I'm keen on this being portrayed as a fiction or making sure that people know it's not real. But I like the term speculative design. A lot of the practice in its recent form emerged from some of the work of Tony Dunn and Fiona Raby. And they had introduced this idea of A and B, that traditionally design works as sort of a slave to industry. So industry decides and the market decides what people will buy, and then designers work against that brief to build things that consumers like and that sort of serve the market. And they asked the question, what would happen if we disconnected design from industry and then use these same techniques to solve different types of problems, to ask different types of questions? So we move from sort of problem solving to problem finding, from providing answers to asking questions, and moving from the consumer to the citizen, from the user to the person, from making us buy to making us think. So there's this whole other space that we can use the techniques of design, use the ways in which we go about building new products and services, but we can use them for different means. And this is some of the work that we're doing. Another idea that you've probably seen that becomes quite important in this space is that if you think about time moving into the future, we sort of have these cones of possibility, or these future cones. And we might have a future that's sort of probable, where with some degree, or with very little, or with a high probability, we could find ourselves in this future on our current trajectory. There are other futures that are sort of plausible, so a little lower in terms of probability, but still could be something that we could, a place we could find ourselves in. And then also there's sort of the edge of possibility and things that are impossible. And with speculative design, we like to design projects at all different levels of probability and at various distances into the future. So a sort of scattershot approach. But what it lets us do is then triangulate and open up discussions about what is the preferable future. And so each of these futures is not to be predictive where we want to go, but it teaches us something about the world and lets us, again, have conversations about what that direction is that we want to be heading. Another important idea is Amara's law. And it essentially suggests that when we look into the future typically and predict how things will change, we do so in a linear fashion. and we look out into the future with this sort of linear change. But in reality, most technology changes in this exponential fashion. And what happens then is we overestimate the change that will happen in the near term. And so we're left kind of disappointed. Well, that wasn't nearly as cool as everybody said it would be. But then there's a point of inflection at which the technology just suddenly takes off, is ubiquitous, is cheap, is available, and is having huge impacts. And we're left behind. We're out of touch with just how quickly that was going. And I think this is one of the reasons why we need to spend more time with speculative design, spend more time designing and thinking about the future, that we're not caught off guard at these inflection points, that we're better prepared for them. So a few just ideas about speculative design, then I'll go into some examples. So speculative design is not fantasy. It's not magic, or we're always trying to be grounded in the reality, and we'll spend a lot of times with the scientists or with policymakers or others who are actually on the cutting edge of this space to understand what is actually plausible and feasible in this world. It's not utopic or dystopic. A lot of times our futures are sort of singular, optimistic visions or very ugly alternatives. But I think in reality, there's this messy middle where it is complex, it's difficult to see, and a lot of times with speculative design, we try to highlight that complexity. It's both good and bad and all simultaneously, and difficult to unpick what is what. We also try to design for messy people. So we try to step away from these idealized corporate visions of the future, and we design for the messy, broken, contradictory people that we are, rather than the sort of perfect customers that we're supposed to be. So we love to show how things will go wrong and how people won't use this correctly, and what sorts of behaviors emerge because of that. Again, we're not predictive. We always try to work in multiples with speculative design. So we're not saying this is what will happen or this is what should happen, but we're trying to highlight and expand the sort of consideration set. It's really useful in unclear context. So again, in a lot of instances, groups don't have perspective on a particular emerging technology, or there's not language within leadership about how the company would deal with some of these directions. And so in those instances, this becomes a useful tool. We like to engage through prototyping. So again, designers are good at making things. And we find that actually making artifacts or making something from these futures helps people sort of suspend their disbelief. They can interact with it in a way, sort of loosens reality's grip on how they're thinking about these worlds. And it lets people understand and engage with this future in a different way, and sort of build empathy for that future. Again, we're looking for answers through questions, and we're trying to generate questions and discussions, and ultimately about creating multiple alternatives, about expanding our consideration set, about expanding our understanding of what is possible. And by doing that, we make better decisions when we understand everything that's available. Okay, so I'll show you a few examples. Enough theory. So I'm going to show you just a handful of fun examples, and then I'll show you some of the work that we've been doing recently. Great. So this is a designer, Susanna. Any guesses on what this object is? I see a lot of puzzled looks in the room. So this is actually an object. Susanna had been working with some researchers who were training bees and looking at bees' ability to detect different chemical signatures. And they realized that they would actually be able to potentially train bees to detect certain chemical signatures that would be advantageous to people. And so this was actually an idea for a cancer detection device, that the individual, once they have cancer, sometimes there are chemical changes to their breath. And so the individual would blow into the object, and the bees would then respond or sort of dance in a particular way if the person was healthy or had a diagnosis of cancer. So again, not that we should build these, or not that they're the best way to be diagnosing cancer, but says something about our relationship with nature, about the capabilities of some of these organisms that we live with, and also there are discussions about our relationship with the medical field and how patients are currently diagnosed or relate to these sorts of things. Great. So this is Kevin, a designer who was interested in sort of our relationships with robots, and this designed this bomb disposal robot with the particular orifice, the sort of pink object there. And smell is actually a particularly important way that we communicate with each other. And there's actually a chemical signature in our sweat that indicates when we're afraid. So you can actually smell the fear in other people. But this is masked by our deodorants and our perfumes and other things. But it actually, we can often sense that, and it changes how we kind of interact with people. And so Kevin wondered about using smell as another type of interactions with robots. And in this instance, the bomb disposal robot releases this same chemical signature of fear. And so as the operator is driving the robot into a dangerous situation, the operator then feels the fear of the robot. And does that then change the way that they handle the robot in a dangerous situation, rather than this just being a sort of throwaway device? So again, each of these helping us to think about different sort of futures and different ways of relating to these technologies. So this is another interesting project. I guess I feel like this is a guessing game for each one. And any guesses on what's happening here? Any thoughts? Lots of quizzical looks. So we've got 3D printing organs. So it's very close. They are organs. So these are replacement hearts that this gentleman is working on. A lot of our visions of replacement organs in the future are through sort of 3D printing or manufacture mechanisms. And the designer, Veronica, in this instance, imagined another sort of future where actually craft becomes the way in which organs are created. And so she was working with some scientists around their work with silk and synthetic genetic modification of silkworms, and the use of silk in biomedical applications. And so in this instance, the craftsman is working with silkworms to create the scaffolding that then the patient's cells are grown on top of, and then that becomes their replacement heart. So a whole new relationship to the object being built, and also the clients coming in to see the progress of their new hearts. Let's see, I'll just mention this quickly. This, I guess, project would fall a little bit more in the space of critical design, or again, a project that just sorts of opens up more questions. But in this instance, Colby was interested in sort of the use of human mouse models. So companies that generate mouse models, and then we test drugs, we test other behavioral experimentation upon those mice. And so Colby actually found some hair of Elvis on eBay, purchased that hair and sent it to a lab and had the DNA sequenced. So he had Elvis's genome. And then there are companies in the world, he didn't actually take this step for ethical reasons, but there are companies in the world where he could send that genome in and then create essentially an Elvis mouse model. And so he proposed that we might have these Elvis mice models. But then the question is, well, how human are they, and how much of Elvis is in this mouse? So then he built a series of behavioral experiments for the mouse to sort of explore and run through that mirrored Elvis's biography. And so the idea is that as the mouse moves through the contraptions, we get to a mouse that is genetically similar to Elvis, but also behaviorally and environmentally, he's gone through a similar experience. But again, a space for us to ask questions about the use of these mouse models, and what does it mean? What is actually our genome in these spaces? A couple more really quickly. So this Diego, looking at our relationships with robots in the home, and as robots move into the home, do we start to change our behaviors to accommodate them, or what sorts of accommodations will we make for them? So in this instance, do we cut steak differently because it's easier for the robot to actually cut it for us? And are we now happy with our steak looking like this? Or the particular grooves in the cutting board for the robot to be able to handle the cutting board more easily than human hands, or even machine-readable labels. So he did a series of images throughout the home looking at these types of trade-offs. And it was interesting. I just went to a friend's house the other day, and realized the style of everything was kind of off the floor, and all of the cords were kind of draped over chairs. It was really quite weird. And then a few minutes later, a Roomba rolled out, and realizing that there are a lot of accommodations that we begin to make for these technologies, and what is that discussion that emerges? And this is one of my favorites. Any guesses on this object, what this is? Actually, you'll never guess, so, unless you've seen it before. What's that? A mousetrap, yeah. So it's a bigger scale. This is about human scale here. And Tony and Fiona, as they were working on this, I think they came across a statistic that some incredible percentage of Americans believe in the possibility of alien abduction. It was a real possibility. And one of the questions was, a lot of times we design for very rational agents, but what happens when we begin to design for their actual beliefs, or how people actually think about the world? So this is an object for people that have that concern. It's a piece of furniture that lives in your home, and you can slide inside, and then it closes up. And it's sort of, the shape is to obscure the human form, and then it matches the floor. So if the aliens are to travel over the top, they can't see you as you blend into the floor. So if you have that concern, this is a lovely piece to have in your home. Okay, so a lot of these are sort of on the very speculative end, but let me show you how some of these instances work. So this was some work that Superflex did for the UAE's Ministry of Energy. And they were thinking about a number of different scenarios that might exist in the future on how they are managing their sort of energy futures. And Anab and team at Superflex, if you're familiar with their work, they're wonderful, but created some of these futures and objects of these futures, looking at the management of energy within cities to sort of play out these different scenarios and open up a conversation between ministers on that. And out of this exhibition and some other pieces that were done there, they made some really big announcements about how the Ministry of Energy was going forward in investment in some of the areas in this space. But I think what's exciting is a lot of these objects are being used now at senior leadership levels to facilitate the discussion, to introduce people to the different possibilities and frames of these directions and what's possible. I'll give kind of one last example of some of the work we've been doing with Movil. Movil's Mercedes-Benz company. They white label a lot of the transport systems back-end technology in the U.S. They also have an app, kind of like City Mapper in Germany, but it allows you to buy all of your tickets, from bike shares to car rentals to trains, through the individual app. So kind of A to B, everything taken care of. And so we've been doing a series of projects with them on future speculative mobility. And I won't mention all of these, but this was kind of an interesting discussion on the amount of surface area that's taken up by cars in cities. I think in LA, they calculated that it's equal to the Black Forest in Germany, just the surface area of cars. And so asking what might that look like if that area was actually greened in some way. So they actually built out a greened vehicle and drove it to different cities in Germany, and then engaged the public in those conversations about the greening of cities, about green energy, renewable energy, also about sort of the wastefulness of personal ownership. But I'll just mention this one up in the corner: where do cars go at night? So one of the questions they've been discussing quite a lot about is the move towards autonomous vehicles. And so they actually created a children's book from some of this work that introduced us to Carla 15. And the children's book kind of goes through Carla's life. And so Carla and other cars are in this city where self-driving cars are now ubiquitous. They're talking to each other. And the little boy is picked up from school and then asks Carla, as she's dropping him off, where do you go at night? And the rest of the story, Carla goes through the city, and we begin to see different pieces of infrastructure. Like she does the cleaning at night of the city streets. She and her friends are delivering packages and other things to companies. She remembers back in the day when car parks were for cars, and now they've been reimagined and reutilized in different ways. But they published the book, and the book traveled throughout the organization. So every executive within the organization had the book, their kids had the book, and it gave them a whole set of language to talk about these possible futures and the impact of self-driving cars on the city. So it was sort of a playful object and a playful narrative, but again, it created a means for decision makers to have a sense and language to talk about some of these implications. So I think speculative design becomes valuable, again, in these instances that we need a discussion space, that we need to open up the conversation about a particular technology or social trend or driver. It's useful to generate perspective in unclear context. When we don't have language about what's going on in a space, when we don't have a strategy in a particular direction, when we don't know how to react to a new technology, these approaches become useful to generate that. It's good for triangulation. Again, it's predicting the future's impossible, but having a lot of different perspectives on possible futures gives us a way to talk about what is preferable, and we can triangulate on what we want to happen and what we want to create. It's important for thought leadership. A lot of organizations don't have perspectives and are sort of waiting for technology to come to them and to disrupt their industry. And so these types of explorations can help generate thought leadership. It makes these future experiences tangible, makes them real, allows people to actually be empathetic with those individuals and themselves who will experience these futures. It's a nice chance to separate from the need of the next quarter and actually to explore and imagine and dream what is actually possible. And that dreaming, I think, is critically valuable as we begin to think about the futures that we want. And ultimately, it's about creating alternatives, so expanding our consideration set and through that making better decisions. Again, we're interested in implications, not applications. I'm not saying this is the technology that should exist, but I'm interested in what might happen if this does exist. Where does it go wrong? What are the knock-on effects of it? And then a way to interrogate or understand how people react to the different designs. So ultimately, again, the goal today was to express this type of methodology and approach. And the hope is that in each of the areas that you're working, that speculative design becomes a place or a type of approach that will become useful in how you're looking at things. So do we need a perspective on this emerging tech, and what might we do to generate our perspectives of these possible speculative futures? And so I don't know on the future of cities exactly, what this looks like, if it's sort of a her world. These visions in film, Brazil and the bureaucracy, or Blade Runner and the corporate powers. I don't know what these futures are, or sort of dreams of Eden-like spaces. But I think speculative design gives us a way to begin to think about them. And also, by designing actual products and services from these worlds, we get a better sense to sort of interrogate them, and a better way to think about actually how it would feel to live in these spaces versus just these sort of larger scales and scapes. I'll just share a few things that we're really interested in exploring. So we're doing a lot of work in sustainability, clean energy. We've been fascinated with the optimization of evolutionary basics. So we think it's just ridiculous that you can't breathe air in London. And so air, water, food, sleep, these sorts of basics and how those are optimized within a city become really interesting. We've also become fascinated with the sort of consideration of everything and universal responsibility. So once you have the capability to measure everything, where does then our responsibility lie? So if alcohol-related accident and injury, it being the #1 expenditure of the NHS in behavioral terms, do alcohol makers actually hold some responsibility there for those knock-on effects? But the type of measurement of everything in universal responsibility, things enabled like that through blockchain become interesting. We're also doing a lot of work with AI and self-driving cars, and then finally universal basic income, so other type of economic models that become meaningful in our cities. So again, hopefully more just inspiration and prompts today. But I think speculative design becomes a place for us to begin to radically expand our consideration sets, sort of imagine and dream what is possible. And I think that then allows us to better understand what is preferred and what we want those futures to look like. So thank you very much, and happy to take some questions or any thoughts on that. Cheers.
Is there any question from the audience? Okay, I'm starting right here.
Hi, thank you. Amazing, wonderful, lots of ideas. I'm interested in what kind of techniques you might use or methods, ranging maybe from live action role play, a very kind of human-based exploration, through to more digital techniques, simulators, models, especially when it comes to looking at the indirect implications, which I imagine are many and complex.
That's great. So we're not we don't focus on a particular technique or approach, but it often just depends on what we can do in the amount of time or what's available. But I think we're very interested in creating some sort of artifact or object, and then I think going to the simulation or how people react to that, we're interested in putting that into some sort of context or narrative. So whether that's showing the object and letting people understand how or imagine what life might be like to live with that, that becomes interesting. But we don't have a particular technique that it's always a go-to. It's always an exploration of what that might be like. I guess generally too, whatever prototyping is done currently for products and services, we think that same prototyping approach generally works for futures. We're just working with different technology and at a different time frame. So yeah.
Jeff Beacon from the Pollution Tax Association. That may give you a clue. You're interested in sustainability, and it would be lovely to see prototypes of ways of living that fit within the carbon budget we've got left. I mean, there have been attempts in this country like the eco-villages, eco-towns, which have been a complete failure, where people have, the ones that got built, have enormous carbon footprints. Now, it's not just whether you can have a prototype, but whether we've got the time to get from here to there within the carbon budget, which is about 100 tonnes a person. Running a car for 30 years is 100 tonnes. Building an apartment is 100 tonnes. You can eat enough beef to get through 100 tonnes. So are you going to think of doing prototype settlements that can fit the bill, can really bring down our carbon footprints quickly?
I think it's a great question. So we should talk after. I'll show you some of the stuff we've done around optimization of happiness and sort of trying to disconnect from consumerism and disconnect from current capitalist systems and still live, or what does a meaningful life look like disconnected from those. But yeah, we should definitely talk after. But I think one thought is it's critical to show people what that looks like, to build a prototype and show what it looks like. I also think it's critical to show what the world looks like when we don't do that. What is our current trajectory? What does that feel like when the air is completely unbreathable in London? What does it look like when we have sort of catastrophic collapse of different ecosystems around the world? What does that look like when our seawalls are sort of failing with sea level rise? So I think we want to find out what that ideal is, but we also want to shock and scare and really understand the implications of our current trajectory. But yeah, would love to talk more.
Julian McGugan, Tech UK. When you've been looking at the possible implications from autonomous vehicles, has part of that been looking at the potential implications for city planning, for urban planning, when the transition's complete? I'm thinking of, for example, what do cities look like when you no longer need on-street parking, roundabouts, traffic lights, pedestrian crossings? Has that been in scope for the work you've been doing?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd be happy to connect. I could show you a little bit more of the Movable work, but those were absolutely pieces that we began to consider with some of those explorations. But I think that's what's key is the tech is the autonomous vehicle, but all of those other things that you've just mentioned, that's where it gets really interesting. And too often the exploration ends there, or we're not really considering those other pieces. So yeah.
Hi. Hello. Just following on from that, really. Do you ever look backwards with a particular technology, for example, the car, considering that in the 20s it wasn't perceived that it would become democratized, that political systems and policy systems would be put in place over the next 70 years that would radically reshape cities and so on, and also things like the growth of India and China. Yeah, I'm wondering really just what an historical approach in your methods might teach us about looking forward.
Yeah, I think the past is a critical space for inspiration about what could happen. So all of those, anything that's happened in the past, or like a model of government interaction with the car industry, becomes a place for us to ask, okay, what if that happened again with this new technology, or what if it looked differently? So yeah, I think the past is a place we're constantly sort of mining for inspiration on how this might play out again, or what does this look like, or have we seen this before, as a sort of analogy for what could come next is really interesting. So yeah, and depending on the project, that looks different, but it's great.
Where do I speak? Which way? Hello. I've read an article. Can I not use it? So I read an article. I might slightly distort the content, but I think it was something around that in 50s. It was about the robots taking over the jobs. And then it was saying that in 50s it was easier to imagine that robots would take over the job places rather than women. So I was wondering if there's any kind of trends that everybody think that they're going to happen, but you think are not going to happen, or what's basically not going to happen.
That's interesting. This would be a terrible note to end on. I'm quite, I don't know if I want to, I'm quite pessimistic, actually, about like our response to climate change. And I don't know if that, so I think there are certain things that I don't know if we're moving quickly enough to avoid some of the really negative and ugly outcomes. So I think there's a lot of optimism that we'll somehow be able, technology will save us in these spaces. But I don't, from what I'm seeing at the moment, I'm quite pessimistic about our ability to do that. So I think life is going to look very different to what it is now, rather than sort of a return to a quick solving of these problems through technology. But I guess with that said, I'm also, I really can't be predictive. So I think I'm more interested in all of the spectrum of what is possible, and want to play there, and then think about what I want to have happen. So what can I change? What do I want that future to look like, and how can we create a shared vision among others of what that future should be? So yeah, good question. I'm going to think about that one more. So, great. More, yeah.
Hi. Regarding shared vision, has it been used for conflict resolution using speculative design for bringing people who don't have, like, in conflict resolution contexts? And how do you measure the impact of speculative design, and where do you want to take it further? So, like, this is what we're doing. How can we improve it?
That's a great question. So I haven't seen it used specifically in conflict resolution, but I have seen it used within organizations where there were a lot of differing perspectives on current strategy. But I think it would be really interesting to apply it to, say, multiple organizations or entities that are dealing with a particular problem. So yeah, I'd be fascinated to explore that. The other piece you mentioned on how speculative design is being used currently, I think one of the big things, a lot of the work initially emerged in Europe was funded by arts organizations or galleries or sort of public-facing, I guess, government-funded spaces. But so I think for me, the real opportunity is how to normalize these approaches in corporate settings. So when it becomes a standardized part of any group's product development or strategy activities, then that's what I think is really exciting. So a lot of our work is to show how, some of these wild designs actually translate into meaningful discussions about strategy and directions moving forward. In terms of where it goes next, I guess I'd fall right in the same line. I'd like to see it be just a standardized piece of process and method. That any time an organization is looking at an emerging technology, or any time we're dealing with sort of a new social trend or pressure, that any organization thinks, okay, this is a moment that we should be speculating and imagining what these possible futures look like. So yeah, I guess a normalization of the practice is what I'm quite excited about.
So it's a little bit on the lines that what she started. I'm Elena Cortero from Room 1, a new lab in London. But so one of the questions I have, more business related, is how do you measure the impact? That's one question. The other one is how you budget projects like this. I find it quite complicated because obviously that goes into a one-by-one basis. And then how you manage IP in those situations. If you have any suggestions or advice on that.
So great. So I missed the question on impact. But so we tend to measure impact by, it can be communication, so how widely the messages have traveled. We often find when we build a prototype, it moves. So establishment of thought leadership within an organization or within a particular industry, media coverage of the particular concept. But a lot of times we're working with an internal team that's trying to impact management's decision on a space. So we find if the work that we've done can travel within the organization, if we generate new language for, and suddenly we hear the CEO speaking with some of these lines and concepts that we've generated, that becomes meaningful. But I think it's hard because so many organizations are focused on, the next few quarters. And we're trying to show that actually by spending time further into the future, we can improve your decision making. And in a few instances, like with the work with Movil, we actually, a lot of times the future gets here faster than we anticipated. So we're building something and we're like, wow, that's so far out. But then actually as we look at it, we go, oh no, this could exist tomorrow. So we've sometimes seen our speculative designs actually feed right into existing product directions and go into the system that way. So that's a question on impact. Great. And your last question on budgeting, maybe we could talk after, but it's generally quite IP. Yeah, so in our situation, we're always turning over IP to the client. So it's a traditional consulting relationship. So we build a lot of ideas, we build things that we think are interesting, but ultimately then it rests with the client in that space. Great.
Unfortunately, we only have time for one more question, but you can obviously hang around and ask Paul afterwards. So I don't know if I'm now biased, but I'm just going to go for the closest.
Hi, I'm a service design student at Ravensbourne. My question is, what's the kind of the life cycle of the project? Because let's say, like in UX design, visual design, we deliver an app and, you go through like wireframes, visual design, and then you have an app, it goes into an app store and then maybe you iterate. So here, what I'm understanding in speculative design, you kind of deliver a vision. Is that kind of like your end deliverable, or like what happens next after the vision? Like you deliver a vision, it goes into leadership, there are some decisions. What happens next?
Great. That's a great question. I think it varies on every project. But ultimately, we're creating some prototype, and the fidelity of that prototype will vary a lot by the amount of time we have. I mean, sometimes it's an actual working prototype. And we're helping them imagine, what would this interaction look like at scale if it existed everywhere. So I think it really varies on the client, but we tend to say that the projects will have a life of 5 years. So anytime we tend to build some object or vision, often there's a span at which the conversations around that or the signals that we were addressing are relevant for a period of time. The other thing that I've been caught a handful of times is we speculated. We thought something was way out, and then it happened much faster. So, for example, Movil did a let's see, it was an April Fool's prank about a self-driving drone taxi. And they created some kind of funny footage of this individual flying over LA. And I think it wasn't a year later that Uber and others announced they actually have programs where they're working on these. So I think, so I think there's a lifespan for the conversation, and then that can be iterated on and explored. But then I think a lot of times too that we find them dying quite quickly when actually it gets overtaken by industry or actual activities going on. So again, just an encouragement to spend more time thinking further out into the future to kind of get ahead of that curve. Great, thank you.
Thank you so much, J. Paul, and thank you so much everyone else for all your questions. Joanna, can people mingle outside and to talk to Paul? Yes, so stay around if you want to talk to Paul, or if you're a service designer who wants a job at FCC, you can also stay around. And yeah, thank you very much for coming, and subscribe to our newsletter to get informed about more events like this. Thank you.